A graduate student in San Diego was cataloging old museum boxes when she found something that shouldn't exist. Broken mastodon bones, with marks that could only come from one thing: humans. The problem? These bones were 130,000 years old. And according to every textbook, someone was off by 117,000 years. So either the dating was catastrophically wrong, or we need to rewrite the entire story of how humans got to the Americas. Stick around, because this rabbit hole goes deep. Let's back up for a second and talk about what we thought we knew. The standard story, the one taught in schools, goes like this. Around 13,000 years ago, during the last ice age, humans crossed from Siberia to Alaska over a land bridge called Beringia. The Bering Strait was frozen, sea levels were lower, and you could literally walk from Asia to North America. These first Americans, called the Clovis people after the distinctive spear points they made, then spread south through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers. They reached the lower 48 states, kept going south, and within a few thousand years, humans had populated both North and South America. That's the story. Simple, neat, supported by decades of archaeological evidence. Clovis points show up in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago, and they're everywhere. New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, all over. Any claims of older sites were treated with extreme skepticism, usually dismissed as poor dating or misidentified evidence. But here's the thing about scientific consensus. It's only as good as the evidence supporting it. And new evidence has been absolutely demolishing the Clovis first model for the past decade. We're not just talking about pushing the dates back a few hundred years. We're talking about potential human presence in the Americas tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone imagined. The Cerruti Mastodon site is where things get crazy. During routine construction for a freeway in San Diego, workers hit something. Paleontologists were called in, and they excavated what looked like a pretty standard Ice Age fossil site. Mastodon, bones, teeth. The usual stuff. They boxed it all up, sent it to the San Diego Natural History Museum, and that was that. The bones sat in storage for 23 years. Then in 2015, graduate student Kathleen Holan was going through these old collections. She's looking at the mastodon bones, and something's off. These aren't normal breaks. When fossilized bones break naturally, from geological pressure or sediment weight, they break in predictable ways. These bones, they were shattered. And not just shattered, but shattered in a very specific pattern that Holan recognized. She'd spent years studying what happens when early humans butcher large animals with stone tools. You can't cut through a mastodon femur with a stone knife, so early humans would break the bones to get at the marrow inside. They'd place the bone on a stone anvil and hit it with another stone, called a hammerstone. This creates a distinctive fracture pattern, impact notches, specific angles of breakage, and that's exactly what Holan was seeing in these 23-year-old museum specimens. She brought in her husband, Stephen Holan, who's also an archaeologist specializing in early human bone modification. They brought in more experts. Paleontologists, forensic anthropologists, geologists, everyone looked at the evidence. And they all came to the same conclusion. These bones were broken by humans using stone tools. But that created a massive problem. The site had been dated using uranium-thorium dating, one of the most reliable methods we have for material this old. The bones were 130,000 years old. That's not 14,000. That's not even close. The idea that any humans, let alone modern humans, were in California 130,000 years ago, that was considered impossible. The team published their findings in the journal Nature in 2017, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. The response was immediate and brutal. Archaeologists lined up to tear the study apart. The criticism wasn't about the dating. That was solid. It was about the interpretation. Were those really human-made fractures? Could natural processes create similar patterns? Was there any actual stone tool evidence at the site? Here's where it gets interesting. The team didn't find traditional stone tools at the site. No spear points, no hand axes. Nothing obviously worked by humans. What they did find were large cobblestones that showed impact damage, and their placement suggested they'd been used as hammers and anvils. But that's not the smoking gun most archaeologists wanted to see. The debate raged for years. Some researchers designed experiments, breaking modern elephant bones with stones to see if they could replicate the fracture patterns. Some could, some couldn't. The controversy kept building, and just when it seemed like the Cerruti site might remain forever disputed, new evidence started appearing from other sites. Lots of other sites. White Sands National Park in New Mexico. In 2021, researchers published findings about fossilized footprints preserved in ancient lakebed sediments. Human footprints. Adults. Children. Even what looked like a teenager running. The tracks were everywhere. Thousands of them. And they were dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That's 10,000 years before Clovis. That's before the ice-free corridor between the glaciers even existed. The dating method was different this time. They dated seeds from aquatic plants that were in the same sediment layers as the footprints. Seeds that were actually stepped on by the people making the tracks. You can't get much more direct than that. And the dates were checked and rechecked. Multiple labs, multiple methods. All confirming the same thing. Humans in New Mexico. 23,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. If people were in New Mexico that early, they couldn't have come through the ice-free corridor. That corridor didn't exist yet. So how did they get there? The new theory gaining traction is the coastal migration route. Instead of walking through the middle of the continent, people traveled along the coast. In boats. This seems wild until you remember that by 23,000 years ago, humans had already reached Australia, which required ocean voyages. They'd colonized islands in Southeast Asia. The idea that they couldn't navigate along the North American coast suddenly seems less crazy, especially because during the Ice Age, sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. The coastline extended way out from where it is now. And all that potential archaeological evidence? It's now underwater, but we're not done. Chiqui White Cave in central Mexico. Excavations there found stone tools in layers dated to 26,000 years ago. That's even older than White Sands. The tools aren't Clovis style. They're cruder, more basic, but they're definitely human-made. You can see where flakes were struck off to create cutting edges. Then there's Cooper's Ferry in Idaho. Stone tools found there date to 16,000 years ago. The really interesting thing about Cooper's Ferry. The tool technology looks similar to tools found in Japan from the same time period. Not Siberia. Japan. This suggests the coastal migration might have involved island hopping across the North Pacific, following the kelp forests that would have provided abundant marine resources. Monte Verde in Chile. This site has been contentious since it was first excavated in the 1970s. But the evidence has held up. Human occupation dated to 14,500 years ago. That's older than Clovis, and it's way down in South America. If Clovis people were the first Americans at 13,000 years ago, how did other people beat them to Chile by 1,500 years? The math doesn't work unless there were earlier migrations. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Genetic evidence. DNA studies of modern Native Americans and ancient remains have revealed something unexpected. There are at least 3 distinct migration events from Asia to the Americas. The first one, the big one that led to most Native American populations, happened around 15,000 to 17,000 years ago. But there's genetic evidence of earlier contacts, earlier mixing with populations that might have arrived before that main migration. Some geneticists are finding DNA markers that suggest a migration route that went along the Pacific coast, exactly what the archaeological evidence is now showing. Other genetic studies have found markers that don't match Siberian populations very well, but do match populations from further south in Asia. This supports the idea of Pacific coastal migration, possibly by boat. But let's get back to that 130,000-year-old California site, because that one's still the most controversial. If the 23,000-year-old footprints are pushing the boundaries of accepted theory, 130,000 years is breaking those boundaries into tiny pieces and setting them on fire. Most archaeologists still don't accept the Cerruti mastodon site as evidence of human presence. The problem is they can't definitively prove it's not human activity either. The team behind the Cerruti research has stood by their findings. They've published follow-up studies. They've addressed criticisms. They've provided more detailed analysis of the fracture patterns. But without finding actual stone tools at the site, without finding more sites of similar age, it remains an outlier. And in archaeology, outliers are treated with intense skepticism. But here's what's interesting. Every time someone has pushed back the dates for human arrival in the Americas, they've been met with skepticism. When Monte Verde was first proposed in the 1970s, it was dismissed for decades before finally being accepted. When sites suggesting pre-Clovis dates of 14,000 or 15,000 years were proposed, they were fought against tooth and nail. And now those dates are mainstream. The pattern keeps repeating. Someone finds evidence of earlier human presence, the establishment rejects it, more evidence accumulates, and eventually the consensus shifts. We're in the middle of that shift right now. The 23,000-year-old footprints at White Sands are becoming accepted. The coastal migration theory is gaining ground. The idea of multiple migration waves at different times is no longer radical. So where does that leave the 130,000-year-old California site? Most researchers still think it's probably not human activity, but they're not as certain as they were 5 years ago. Because if humans were in the Americas 23,000 years ago, and we only discovered that recently, who's to say there weren't even earlier populations that left less evidence? Here's the thing about the Ice Age Americas that makes early sites so hard to find. During the peak of the last glaciation, massive ice sheets covered Canada and the northern United States. Two main sheets, the Cordilleran along the west coast and the Laurentide covering most of Canada and the northern plains. These glaciers were miles thick. When they melted, starting around 15,000 years ago, they scoured the landscape. Any archaeological sites that were in their path got destroyed, ground up, scattered. So if there were human populations in North America during the Ice Age, evidence from the northern regions would be incredibly hard to find. It's gone, obliterated by glaciation. The sites that survived would be in the southern regions that weren't glaciated, places like California, New Mexico, Texas, and the Southwest. And that's exactly where we're finding these controversial early sites. There's also the issue of sea level rise. Sea levels rose by 300 feet. The coastline where early humans might have lived, where they might have had settlements if they were following a coastal migration route, all of that is now underwater. We're talking about hundreds of miles of coastline that's now 300 feet below the ocean's surface. Any archaeological sites there are gone or inaccessible. Some researchers have started doing underwater archaeology, trying to find submerged Ice Age sites. It's incredibly difficult. You're searching for small artifacts in areas that have been churned by ocean currents for thousands of years. But they're trying, and occasionally they find things. Stone tools dredged up by fishing boats. Submerged sinkholes in Florida that contain Ice Age animal bones with cut marks. Nothing definitive yet, but it's early days. The other problem with finding early sites is that populations were probably tiny. If there were humans in the Americas 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, there weren't many of them. Small populations leave less evidence. They have fewer sites. The odds of finding any particular site drop dramatically when you're talking about a few hundred people spread across an entire continent. Populations had grown. People were everywhere. They were hunting megafauna, making distinctive stone tools, leaving clear archaeological signatures. Finding Clovis sites is relatively easy. Finding evidence from 10,000 years earlier? That's like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. But technology is improving. Ground-penetrating radar can find buried sites without excavation. LiDAR can map terrain through forest canopy, revealing ancient features. Genetic analysis is getting better at extracting DNA from older and more degraded samples. Chemical analysis can identify human activity at sites even without finding artifacts. We're developing new tools that might finally give us answers to questions that have lingered for decades. There's also the question of who these early people were. The White Sands footprints show adults and children, so we know they had families. They had communities. But what else can we learn? Footprints don't tell us much about culture, technology, or lifestyle. The scattered stone tools from various early sites suggest they were hunting and processing animals. One thing we can say is that these early Americans were adaptable. They survived in environments that were radically different from today. The Ice Age Southwest wasn't desert. It was cooler, wetter, with forests and grasslands where deserts exist now. Horses, mammoths, giant ground sloths, all kinds of megafauna that are now extinct. These early people learned to hunt them, to avoid predators like saber-toothed cats and dire wolves, to find water and shelter in a challenging environment. And if the coastal migration theory is correct, They were maritime specialists. They knew how to build boats. It requires different skills, different tools, different knowledge. The extinction of the megafauna is another piece of the puzzle. Around 12,000 years ago, most of North America's large Ice Age animals went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, camels, horses, giant sloths, all gone. Humans were blamed for this. The idea was that Clovis hunters arrived, found animals that had never seen humans before, and hunted them to extinction in just a few hundred years. It's called the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis. But if humans were in the Americas for thousands of years before the extinctions, that theory falls apart. These animals would have coexisted with humans for millennia. They would have learned to avoid humans, to recognize them as threats. The extinction pattern becomes much harder to explain. Climate change probably played a bigger role than previously thought. The end of the Ice Age brought rapid environmental changes. Forests replaced grasslands. Temperatures warmed. Precipitation patterns shifted. Maybe the animals couldn't adapt fast enough. Or maybe it was a combination. Humans hunting them, climate changing their habitat, diseases introduced by human migration, multiple stressors hitting at the same time. We don't know for sure. But the new earlier dates for human arrival in the Americas definitely complicate the extinction debate. There's also a cultural aspect to all of this that often gets overlooked. Native American oral traditions have always said their ancestors have been in the Americas forever. They didn't come from somewhere else. They originated here. For a long time, archaeologists dismissed these traditions as myths, not literal history. But as the dates for human presence keep getting pushed back, some researchers are starting to wonder if there's more to these oral traditions than they initially thought. That doesn't mean humans actually originated in the Americas. Genetic and fossil evidence clearly shows humans evolved in Africa. But if human presence in the Americas goes back not 13,000 years, but 20,000, 30,000, maybe even longer, that starts to approach the deep time that oral traditions describe. It's a subtle but important shift in how archaeology engages with indigenous knowledge. The Cerruti Mastodon site, even if it remains controversial, has had an important impact on the field. It forced archaeologists to re-examine their assumptions. It made people more willing to consider earlier dates, more willing to look at evidence they might have dismissed before. Whether or not those particular bones were broken by humans 130,000 years ago, the site contributed to a broader rethinking of early human presence in the Americas. And that rethinking is ongoing. New sites are being discovered. Old sites are being re-examined with new techniques. The story of how and when humans first arrived in the Americas is being rewritten in real time. What we think we know today might be outdated in 5 years. That's exciting but also frustrating. We want answers. We want certainty, but science doesn't work that way. Here's where we stand right now. In early 2026, the mainstream consensus is shifting to accept human presence in the Americas by at least 20,000 to 23,000 years ago, based on sites like White Sands. The coastal migration theory is gaining acceptance as a complement to a replacement for the ice-free corridor theory. Multiple migration waves from different source populations in Asia are now considered likely. Sites suggesting even earlier dates, like Cerruti at 130,000 years or Chiquihuite at 26,000 years, are still debated. They're not fully accepted, but they're not completely dismissed either. They're in that uncomfortable middle ground where more evidence is needed. And researchers are actively looking for that evidence. The next few years are going to be crucial. There are excavations happening right now that might provide the definitive proof needed to settle some of these questions. Underwater archaeology is expanding, searching for submerged coastal sites. Genetic studies are getting more sophisticated, able to detect population movements and mixing events with greater precision. What seemed impossible 10 years ago is now plausible. What seemed radical 5 years ago is now mainstream. The trend is clear. Humans arrived in the Americas earlier than we thought, probably much earlier. The question now isn't if the dates will be pushed back further, but by how much. Every new discovery changes the picture slightly. Every new piece of evidence adds to our understanding. In a museum collection, or buried under a parking lot, or 300 feet underwater off the coast of California, there might be evidence that pushes the dates back even further. Maybe 40,000 years. Maybe 50,000. Maybe we'll find definitive proof that humans were here during the last interglacial period. over 100,000 years ago. Or maybe we won't. And earlier claims will fall apart under scrutiny. That's the nature of science. You follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts what you believed yesterday. What we can say for certain is that the story of the peopling of the Americas is far more complex than anyone imagined. Multiple migrations, different routes, different time periods, different source populations. It's messy and complicated and absolutely fascinating. And we're living through the time when this story is being uncovered. Thanks for watching. If you want more content about the latest archaeological discoveries and what they mean, hit subscribe. More videos coming soon.